The auction started at 9 in the morning, and by 10:30, the big items were going fast. This was October of 2012, a Thursday, and the lot behind the Cimarron County sale barn was packed tighter than anyone in the county had seen it packed in years. Not because it was a good day for buying, though some men there were hoping it would be. It was packed because Ray Dutton's name was on the sign, and Ray Dutton had been farming these panhandle flats since before some of the bidders in the crowd had started shaving. People came out of something that sits between respect and dread, the particular feeling that rises when a man who did everything right by the conventional measure still ends up watching his equipment leave on another man's flatbed. Dale Reynolds stood near the back of the crowd, close to the fence line, his hands in the pockets of a canvas work coat that was faded at every seam. Connie stood beside him, one shoulder touching his, not speaking. They had driven over in Dale's pickup, a 1993 three-quarter ton with 240,000 miles on it, and a crack in the dashboard that Connie had covered years ago with a strip of cloth tape. Neither of them had come to bid. The Combine came out third. It was a 1992 model, one of the big ones, the kind Ray had bought new on a credit note for approximately $185,000, the same year Dale had patched the hydraulic line on his own machine with parts he ordered from a salvage dealer in Liberal, Kansas. The auctioneer started at $40,000, and the crowd moved it up by halves and quarters until it sold at $53,500. Dale watched a man he didn't recognize write a check at the portable table near the gate. He did not look at Ray. He already knew where Ray was standing, over by the grain truck, arms crossed, boots planted in the caliche like a man waiting for something to be over that won't be over for a long time. Connie reached into her coat pocket and touched the edge of a small, hard-bound notebook she had carried from home that morning. She did not take it out. She just held it there, through the canvas and the lining, the way someone holds a thing they are not ready to explain. Let me tell you about that notebook. It had belonged to Dale's father, Robert, and before Robert wrote in it, it had been a blank thing his own father picked up at the hardware store in Boise City sometime in the late 40s. Robert started making entries in May of 1951. Not a diary, not a farm log in any formal sense, a soil notebook, which is a specific and different thing. Robert wrote down what he observed in the ground the way a doctor writes down what he hears in a chest, field by field, year by year, what the soil looked like when he turned it, what it looked like when he didn't, what the wheat came up like after a dry march compared to a dry march the year before, which cover he ran between rotations and what that cost him in the short term, and returned to him over 5 years. He wrote in pencil, tight and deliberate, and he crossed nothing out. If he was wrong about something, he wrote the correction underneath it and left the original entry alone. He wanted to see his own mistakes clearly. Dale had read that notebook 40 or 50 times by the time he inherited the 320 acres from Robert in 1987. He had read it the way some men read a manual for a piece of equipment they will operate for the rest of their lives. He knew which fields drained first and which held moisture the longest. He knew which rotation his father had tried and abandoned in the wet years of the early 60s. And he knew the rotation Robert had quietly returned to in the dry years of the late 60s, when the neighbors who'd laughed at him the first time were suddenly asking questions at the co-op counter. He had been 29 years old when he took the farm over, and he had not gone to college, and he had not attended the state's soil management certification program that the Extension Office was promoting at the time. He had read the notebook. The 320 acres was dry land wheat and winter rye, no irrigation, no center pivot systems, no borrowed water. The panhandle of Oklahoma is not forgiving country. It does not give a farmer much margin for error, and it gives a farmer in debt no margin at all. Dale had understood this from the time he was a boy watching his father walk the field edges in the evening, reading the ground the way the notebook described, looking for the things that told you what next year would bring before next year arrived. What Dale's father had recorded, across 36 years of entries, was essentially a case against disturbance, against tillage that went deeper than necessary, against inputs that the soil had not asked for, against debt that outran the land's demonstrated capacity to carry it. The notebook did not use those words. Robert Reynolds was not given to theory. He wrote things like, "Turn the east quarter again, more than it needed, see what it cost in May," and then in May he wrote what it cost. Now let me tell you about Holt Briggs, because to understand what happened in Cimarron County over the following 25 years, you have to understand what Holt believed and why he believed it so completely. Holt arrived as the Extension District Supervisor in the summer of 1989. He was 34 years old, dressed in a pressed khaki shirt, with the state Extension seal on the chest pocket, and he drove a late-model sedan that was clean in a way that suggested it had never been parked in a field. He had a graduate degree in agronomy from a state university, and a genuine belief that the science coming out of the land-grant research stations was the most reliable guide a farmer could follow. He was not a dishonest man. He was not unkind, not exactly. He was simply very confident in a way that left no room for the knowledge that doesn't appear in peer-reviewed print. He held his first county co-op meeting in September of 1989. About 40 farmers came, which was a reasonable turnout for a Panhandle co-op meeting on a weekday evening. Holt walked them through the state's current recommendations on input timing, variety selection, and tillage depth. He had charts. He had yield data from research station plots in central Oklahoma, which is not the Panhandle, but Holt explained that the principles translated. Dale sat in the third row and did not ask a question. When Holt finished his presentation and opened the floor, a man named Gerald Sims, who farmed south of Clayton, asked Holt what he thought about low-disturbance rotations for the dry land operators who couldn't afford to chase input costs through a bad year. Holt said it was a fair question, and that the research suggested that conventional tillage with properly timed inputs consistently outperformed heritage rotation methods on yield per acre. He said the era of farming by instinct and passed-down observation was giving way to a body of knowledge that was more reliable than any individual's experience, however long that experience ran. Then Holt looked at Dale, whom someone at the co-op had pointed out to him before the meeting, and said, "Operators like Dale Reynolds here, farming the way his dad farmed, they're going to find it harder and harder to keep pace. I don't say that with any disrespect. I say it because the numbers will show it." Dale did not respond. He drove home in the 1993 pickup, which was actually a 1989 pickup at that point, and he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open to his father's entry for October 1968, which read, "Dry fall. Held back on the second pass, neighbors went deep. We'll check moisture retention by February." And in February 1969, Robert had written, "Held well. Their fields blue." Connie poured coffee and asked what the meeting had said. Dale told her. She looked at the notebook for a moment and said, "He hasn't farmed a Panhandle drought yet." That was 1989. In 1992, Ray Dutton signed into the state-backed input financing program that Holt's office was administering, and Ray doubled his planted acres from 400 to 800 by leasing additional ground from a retirement-age neighbor who wanted cash without management responsibility. Ray bought the new combine that year, the one that would eventually sell for $53,500 at the 2012 auction, on a note of approximately $185,000. He bought a new grain cart, a new air seeder, and a set of pull-type field cultivators. He came to the co-op that fall wearing a clean hat and talking about economies of scale. He was not wrong that the math could work. He was working the math at a very specific moment in commodity prices. And commodity prices do not stay in any particular place for very long. Dale stayed at 320 acres. He repaired the hydraulic line on his existing combine. He ordered the salvage parts from Liberal and installed them himself on a Saturday morning with a manual open on the fender and a cup of coffee cooling on the tire. His per-acre cost of operation that year was lower than it had been the year before, because the repair cost him $412 and a day's labor, and a new machine would have cost him the equivalent of 6 or 7 years of the farm's net margin. He did not tell Ray any of this. Ray had not asked. By 1994, Holt had been the district supervisor for 5 years, and he had developed a comfortable familiarity with the county that made him feel he understood it. He had attended enough meetings, visited enough operations, and reviewed enough yield reports to believe his original assessment of the Panhandle was confirmed. At the county fair that August, he found himself at the grandstand podium speaking to an audience that included several of the same farmers from his 1989 co-op meeting. And he was in the comfortable register of a man delivering a conclusion he has already made. He talked about where Panhandle wheat production was heading, and he made a specific prediction. He said that operations holding to heritage methods, rotating without synthetic nitrogen scheduling, and running reduced disturbance tillage would see their per-acre yields average out below the county mean within 5 years. He said this while looking out at a grandstand that included Dale and Connie, who were seated on the far left aisle on the second row of bleachers, Connie with a program folded in her lap, and Dale with his arms resting on his knees. "Some operators in this county are farming the way their fathers farmed," Holt said, and his voice carried easily in the warm air. "I respect the tradition. I want to be clear about that. But tradition is not a yield strategy. And within 5 years, the document averages will show the gap clearly. I'd encourage every operator who's still farming by a notebook, rather than by a research protocol, to take a serious look at what the Extension Office can offer." He said this in front of witnesses. He said this in front of the county recorder's wife, 2 bankers, a local newspaper correspondent who wrote a brief item about the fair that ran on page 6 the following Wednesday, and approximately 190 other people, and not one of them heard Dale Reynolds say a word in response. Because Dale didn't respond that day either. He drove home in the pickup. He opened the notebook to his father's entry for the drought of 1956, which covered 4 pages and included a hand-drawn map of which fields Robert had kept in the winter cover and which he had not, and what each field's moisture retention had looked like the following spring. Then Dale opened a separate ledger of his own, the one he had been keeping since he took the farm over in 1987, and he wrote down his projected rotation for the following season and the expected per-acre input cost, which was lower that year than the county average by a margin that would have surprised anyone who had seen his equipment. He was going to let the 5 years run. He figured the ground would speak for itself by then. If you find this story worthwhile, a like or a comment helps others find it. Now let me finish telling you what happened. The 5 years ran. Then another 5, then another. Between 1995 and 2008, Dale tracked his per-acre yields in his own ledger alongside the county averages that the Extension Office published each fall. His numbers were not spectacular. In good years, he came in near the county mean or slightly below it because his input rates were conservative, and his tillage was shallow, and his soil was doing work that wouldn't show up in a single season's yield. It would show up over decades in the organic matter accumulation and the water retention profile. In dry years, though, which on the Panhandle came in cycles as regular as prayer, his numbers separated from the county mean in a direction that Holt had not predicted. In the dry summer of 1998, Dale's West Quarter came in at 21 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 13. In 2002, another dry year, his East Fields averaged 19 bushels per acre against a county mean of 12. His father had written in the notebook, in the entry for the dry year of 1961, that the undisturbed soil holds what the sky won't give you. Dale had read that line enough times that he could say it without looking at the page. Ray's numbers were different. Ray's per-acre yields in the good years were solid, better than Dale's in some seasons, which was the result of the nitrogen program and the variety package the state office recommended. In good years, the math worked for Ray. His expanded acreage generated enough gross revenue to service the combine note and the input financing and still net him something. But his input costs were rising each cycle because the variety resistance curves required incremental adjustments to the chemical program, and the adjustments cost money, and the money had to be borrowed against the following season. By 2003, Ray was carrying approximately $400,000 in operating debt across his 800 acres, and his annual debt service was the kind of number that left no room for a bad year. Dale's operating debt in 2003 was zero. He had paid off the farmhouse in 1999. He had repaired rather than replaced his combine twice in that period, at a combined cost of roughly $11,000. He had bought a used grain cart for $8,000 at an estate sale in 1997. His bin capacity sat at 30,000 bushels, and in years when his yield outpaced immediate cash flow needs, he stored rather than sold, holding the grain against a better price and against the possibility that a bad year would require the reserve. Connie kept the Extension Office's published yield reports in a folder in the kitchen drawer. Every fall, she added the new one. She did not make a point of this. She just kept them the way a person keeps documents that may matter later without saying why. Around 2001, there was a stretch of 6 weeks in the late winter when cash was thin enough that Dale sat with his ledger 3 nights running trying to find a number that would let him replace a worn elevator belt on the combine without pulling from the grain reserve. He eventually found it by deferring a fence repair on the north pasture boundary and ordering the belt direct from the manufacturer rather than through the local supply dealer, which saved him $112. Connie watched him work through it without comment. One evening, she put a cup of coffee beside the ledger and said, "Your dad had worse and stayed." Dale said, "I know it." He replaced the belt. He deferred the fence. He did not touch the grain reserve. There was no single moment when the external pressure announced itself. It arrived the way a dry summer arrives on the Panhandle, gradually and then all at once, with a clarity that felt in retrospect like it should have been obvious to everyone watching. In 2009, the spring was dry. Not catastrophically, but persistently. The kind of dry that a soil with good organic matter and careful cover can partially compensate for, and the kind of dry that a soil that has been worked hard for several years without recovery time cannot. By July of 2009, the county average was tracking toward 11 bushels per acre for the winter wheat. Dale's fields were holding at a projected 18, because the soil his father had begun managing carefully in 1951 and Dale had continued to manage carefully since 1987, was doing in the worst year exactly what it had been built to do. It was holding what the sky wouldn't give. Ray missed his first operating note payment in the spring of 2010. He had applied for a drought assistance program through the state, but the disbursement timing did not align with the note date, and the bank that held his operating line did not have the appetite in 2010 that it had carried in 1992. The letter from the bank arrived on a Thursday. Ray's wife, a quiet woman named Sandra, called Connie that evening, not to ask for anything, just to have someone to say it to out loud. By 2011, the drought had deepened into something that had a name now, the kind of dry that gets written about, and Ray's 800 acres were yielding a county average 11 to 14 bushels in good fields, and less in the ones that had been pushed hardest. His combine sat in the yard a month longer than usual that fall, because the repairs it needed ran to $12,000, and the operating account wouldn't carry them without delaying a supplier payment. He delayed the supplier payment. In the spring of 2012, the bank called the note. Dale's grain bin held 30,000 bushels of carryover wheat that he had not sold at the 2009 or 2010 bottom prices. He had watched the price per bushel drop in those years to levels that didn't reward the cost of hauling. And he had done the calculation his father had recorded doing in 1957. Figure what it costs to store. Figure what a patient man gets for waiting. Note which choice the land can support without a cash emergency. The land had supported the wait because Dale had no debt service, no operating note, no lease payment on machinery that was already sold or being sold. The land had held. He had held with it. He sat at the kitchen table in February of 2012 and wrote out a single line in his ledger. Bin full, price recovering, will move at spring. He sold in March at a price that was nearly double what it had been at the 2010 bottom. He and Connie drove to the Dutton sale in October without discussing whether they should go. It was the right thing to do, to be there, without gloating, without staying away, which would have been its own kind of statement. They stood by the fence line and watched the combine sell and the grain cart sell and the air seeder sell and the field cultivators sell, piece by piece until the lot was mostly empty and the auctioneer was calling the smaller items near the tailgate of a truck. Ray stood by the grain truck the entire morning. He did not look over at Dale. Dale did not move from the fence line. When it was over, Dale walked to where Ray was standing and put his hand out. Ray shook it. Neither man said anything for a moment. Then Ray said, "Should have asked you more questions." It came out in two pieces, with a breath in the middle, the way an apology does when it costs something to say. Dale said, "You did what made sense at the time." He meant it. He drove home in the old pickup with Connie beside him and the notebook in her coat pocket. And he did not say anything else about the auction for the rest of the day. Now let me tell you about the spring of 2014, because this is the part that still sits with me when I think about what Dale's method actually meant. Holt Briggs arrived at Dale's South Field on a morning in early May without much advance notice. He had called Connie 2 days before and asked if it would be acceptable to bring a colleague, a soil scientist from the University Extension, who had been running a long-term study on dryland management outcomes across the southern plains. Connie had said it was fine and told Dale that evening while he was washing up after chores. Dale walked out to meet them. He was wearing the canvas work coat, which was more faded now than it had been in 1989, but structurally the same coat. And his boots were the color of the caliche he'd been walking since before Holt Briggs had his graduate degree. The soil scientist, whose name was Dr. Elaine Kurtz, had a probe and a sample kit and a tablet with a database she had been building since 2004. She walked Dale's south field for about an hour, taking cores at intervals, measuring organic matter percentage, recording the soil structure at different depths. Holt walked beside her. He said very little. Dr. Kurtz said a good deal to Dale and to her tablet. She said the organic matter percentage in the south field was measuring at 4.2%, which was nearly double the county average. She said the aggregate structure at 8 inches was showing a stability profile she typically associated with fields that had been managed with minimum disturbance for at least 2 to 3 decades. She asked Dale when his father had started the reduced tillage rotation. Dale said, "The notebook goes back to 1951. She wrote that down. Holt stood at the edge of the field for a long time after Dr. Kurtz had finished her cores. Dale stood a few feet away, not trying to fill the silence. Eventually Holt said, "The 94 prediction, the 5-year yield comparison." Dale said, "Yes." Holt said, "Your averages in the drought years." Dale said, 18 to 22, most of them. Holt said, "County was 11 to 14. Dale said, "That's what Connie's folder shows." There was another pause. Holt looked at the field. Dr. Kurtz was making notes some distance away, not listening or pretending not to. Holt said, "Nah, I gave bad advice. It came out flat." Not as an apology exactly, not yet. More as a man reading a result he had been hoping would come out different. He was 59 years old, and he had been the district supervisor for 25 years, and this was the first time he had stood in a field and said those 3 words in that order. Dale did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You believed what you were taught. That's not nothing." He meant that too. Holt retired from the Extension Service the following year. He did not make a large public announcement of it. He just stopped coming to the co-op meetings, and the district got a new supervisor who was younger and, according to what Connie heard from a neighbor, had spent a semester studying low-input dryland methods in the Texas Panhandle before taking the job. Dr. Kurtz included Dale's Southfield data in a paper she published in 2016, citing the Reynolds family's continuous low-disturbance management record from 1951 forward as one of the longest documented heritage rotation sequences in the Southern Plains. She cited the soil notebook by date. She did not name Dale in the paper's title, only in the acknowledgments, where she wrote that his willingness to share 70 years of family observation had materially improved the study's baseline. Connie cut that page out of the journal when a copy came to the county library and taped it to the inside back cover of the notebook. She told Dale about it. He said, "That's fine." He went back out to check the north field. In the spring of 2019, a young woman named Patrice Moore came to the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 26 years old and had been farming a rented plot north of Clayton on shares for 2 seasons, working with a seed variety her landlord had selected, and using inputs she did not have the capital to question. She had attended a county field day where Dale had been asked, without much warning, to talk for 15 minutes about dryland rotation principles, and she had stayed afterward while everyone else went to the lunch tables, and she had asked him one question: "How do you know when the soil is ready for the next pass?" Dale had thought about it for a moment and then said, "You watch it through 1 full dry year before you decide anything. The dry year tells you what's actually there." She had driven home and thought about that for 6 months. Then she called Connie and asked if she could come and talk. She sat at the kitchen table across from Dale and Connie and laid out what she knew and what she needed. She needed ground she could manage on her own terms, enough of it to demonstrate the method over multiple seasons, and she needed a price structure that didn't require her to borrow against an unproven yield record. She said all of this plainly, without apology, the way someone talks when they have already decided to say the real thing. Dale looked at Connie. Connie looked at her hands for a moment, which was a thing she did when she had already made up her mind and was giving Dale a second to catch up. Dale said they had 40 acres on the east boundary that had been fallow for 2 seasons, resting, and that he would lease it to her for $28 an acre annually with a 5-year term and a first option to buy at $1,200 an acre at the end of the term. The county market rate for dry land lease ground in Cimarron County that year was $47 an acre. The 40 acres would cost her $1,120 a year. Patrice looked at the number he had written on a piece of paper. She said, "That's not the market rate." Dale said no. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're going to use it right." The lease was signed that April. Patrice moved a small seed drill and a used field cultivator onto the east boundary property by June, and she spent the first season exactly as Dale had suggested, watching. She walked the 40 acres in June and July and August, taking notes in the new blank notebook she had brought to the house that first Tuesday, writing down what she observed the way Robert Reynolds had written down what he observed in 1951 in the same county, in the same dry air, on the same caliche-edged ground. She asked Dale questions, not many, and not the kind that expected him to tell her what to do. She asked what his father had written about the field's moisture behavior in an August like this one. Dale would open the notebook and find it, and Patrice would read it and write something her own. That fall, she ran a winter rye cover on the 40 acres. The rye came in clean. Ray Dutton, by this time, was leasing back 300 acres of his original 800 from the operation that had bought it at the creditor's sale following the 2012 note call. He was farming it on a cash lease, a tenant on ground he had once owned, and doing it without complaint because it was the ground he knew, and the alternative was moving away from the only county he had ever farmed. He was a decent man in a hard position, and he had arrived at it by doing what a confident state supervisor had told him was the right way to grow. Dale saw Ray at the co-op a few times a year. They talked about weather and prices and the condition of the county roads, the way men who have known each other for 30 years talk about everything and nothing simultaneously. Dale never mentioned 1992. He never mentioned the auction. Ray never said more about it than he had said at the fence line that October morning, though once in the spring of 2021, he watched Patrice drive past on the county road toward the east boundary 40 and asked Dale who that was. Dale said, "Young woman farming the east boundary. She's got a good eye." Ray watched the truck for a moment. He said, "She using your dad's rotation?" Dale said, "She's making her own, based on it." Ray nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing something that has taken a while to arrive. He said, "That's good." He went back to his coffee. By the fall of 2023, Dale and Connie had been farming 320 acres for 36 years, which was longer than Dale's father had farmed it before passing it to him. The farmhouse had not been substantially remodeled in that time. The kitchen was the same kitchen where the notebook had sat on the table in 1989 while Holt explained at the co-op meeting that heritage methods were losing ground. The lamp above the table was a different lamp, a replacement bulb several times over, but the same fixture that Robert had installed in 1963 when he wired the kitchen for overhead light. The pickup in the yard was a 2004 model now, bought used in 2009 from a dealer in Boise City for $6,400 cash. It had 190,000 miles on it, and a working heater and a crack in the passenger seat vinyl that Connie had covered with a piece of the same kind of cloth tape she had used on the dashboard of the 1993 truck before they retired it. She did not find this funny or ironic. It was just the practical thing. In September of 2023, Patrice completed the 4th year of her 5-year lease. She had been keeping her own soil notebook for 4 full seasons now, the original blank one from the Tuesday she had come to the table, plus a second one she had started when the first one filled. The 40 acres was showing the same organic matter trajectory that Dale's South Field had shown in the 1990s, the slow, patient accumulation that doesn't appear in a single season's yield, but shows up unmistakably over time in the way the soil handles a dry August. Patrice's rye cover had established clean enough that a neighbor 2 properties over had stopped by to ask what variety she was running, and she had told him, and then she had told him why the tillage pass mattered more than the variety, and the neighbor had stood there thinking about it, the way a person does when they have been told something simple that they will not be able to unsimplify. Dale walked the 40 acres with her one evening in October. The harvest was in, the cover was up, the soil was doing what the soil does when nobody bothers it more than necessary, which is quietly, over a long time, building something that will hold when the sky goes short. He had brought the notebook. He stopped at the corner of the field where his father had first mapped the east boundary in the entry for April 1952, a small pencil sketch of the drainage pattern with notes on which direction the surface water moved in a hard rain. He held the notebook out to Patrice. She looked at it for a moment without taking it. She knew what it was. She said, "I'll take care of it." He said, "I know." She held it the way Connie had held it through the canvas of her coat pocket at the 2012 auction. The way you hold something that is not finished being useful. Dale put his hands in his pockets and looked out at the cover crop. The rye was coming in even. The rows were straight. The ground between them was dark where the moisture was held, the way his father had described it in 1951, the way Dale had kept it for 36 years, the way Patrice had understood it from the first time she walked this particular 40 acres and watched what it did through a dry August before she asked it to do anything else. Connie was on the porch when they walked back up from the field. She had a cup of coffee, and she handed one to Dale without comment, the way she had done most evenings for most of their farming years together. She looked at Patrice's hands, at the notebook in them, and she nodded once. A small, deliberate nod, and then she looked back out at the field. The Panhandle sky was going dark at the edges and holding gold in the center, the way it does in October when the air is cleared after a dry summer, and the light has nowhere in particular to be. The notebook was gone from the shelf where Connie had kept it since 1987. The shelf held a coffee mug and a spare pen and nothing else. The lamp above the kitchen table was on inside, its light warm in the window, and the farm was quiet in the way it gets quiet at the end of a day when the work has been done correctly, and tomorrow the same work will begin again, and the ground will hold what it holds, and that will be enough.